Hello, bros. We're back with The Devil and the Jews by Joshua Trachtenberg, the medieval conception of the Jew and its relation to modern anti Semitism, a 1943 book. Obviously, this is a reprint, and let's get on with it. Let's get on with it, bruv. Chapter 12. Hopefully, this cough isn't going to continue. Like this. Don't like this at all. Open this. Turn that off. No, we want to turn that off. What time is it? 11:48. Chapter 12. Infidel or heretic. So much for the attitude of the church to the Jew. In general, now to come down to specific cases. What was the immediate origin of the superstitious accusations that emerged in full force during the century or two after the First Crusade? It is in the prevailing attitude toward heresy that we shall find the answer to this question, which, however, involves still another. How did the infidel Jew come to be popularly identified as heretics when canon law and the repeated official pronouncements of popes and councils specifically excluded such an identification? What's up, bruv? The Crusades are a clue to the unrest that afflicted Christendom. At the height of its Catholic power, the Church was not unaware of the rise of forces that threatened to destroy its hard-won unity. Even as the See of St. Peter was demonstrating its supremacy in the dramatic scene at Canossa, secular forces were beginning to assert themselves anew and to question the universal hegemony of the Vicar of Christ. Nor was the temporal authority of the Church alone in issue. Its internal discipline was, at best, infirm and limited, and worst of all, unorthodox ideologies were once more raising their insolent heads as they had done in the first centuries of the Church's history. To challenge the doctrinal basis of Catholic belief, the great need of the time was to rally all Christendom once more around its focal city, to draw secular and ecclesiastical forces into an alliance that would accept and realize the Christian idea of the church state. In 1096 began the series of continent-wide expeditions against the Muslims. It is not inconceivable that, just as wise statesmen have done many times before and since, the leaders of the church hoped to unite Christendom with this onslaught upon an external enemy. Yo, shout out my broski. Dixon Mayes. I need some tissues. My nose is running. All right. Where was I? Where was I, bruv? In a cause whose I don't even know where I was. Hope to unite Christendom with this onslaught upon an external enemy. In a cause whose idealistic goal must contravene all mundane interests, trusting that the centrifugal forces already manifest would be weakened or destroyed in the process, though the Crusades need not have been conceived in this Machiavellian fashion. Their true historical purpose was indubitably that of a unifying agency. That the Crusades did not, in the end, achieve this purpose, and that the rift within Christendom continued to widen, is evidenced by the establishment of the Inquisition, essentially an instrument of unification through propaganda and repression. Pardon. When the church could not otherwise persuade to conform, it was prepared to coerce by force, or else to exterminate. The Inquisition, too, was, in the end, ineffectual. The Protestant Reformation completed the dread process that had been eating into the vitals of the Catholic Church, of the Church Catholic, pardon, I can't even speak, the Church Catholic, and finally divided Christendom permanently, ensuring the prerogative of doctrinal nonconformity. The church was, in principle, a totalitarian power seeking to exercise unlimited dominion in the temporal and spiritual realms, not always unchallenged, but with its confidence in its divine election to this role unshaken. Like all totalitarian powers, it refused to tolerate difference, independence of thought, or action, for these imperiled its own position. During its earliest centuries, it fought heresy tooth and nail, giving no quarter until each sect in its turn was vanquished. It taught its adherents to shun unorthodox and unlicensed movements within the church as the devil himself, and not alone to shun them, but to extirpate them with the same fury they should display towards its satanic arch opponent. Is that really one word? For some centuries, the church was little troubled with heretics, but the 11th and 12th centuries witnessed the return of organized dissent, part of a broad social movement implying serious revolt against the church and against the social and intellectual system it embodied, which constituted a real threat to Catholic unity. The church promptly renewed and intensified its anti heresy propaganda, which was so effective in certain places that it led, during the late 11th and early 12th centuries, to several lynchings of heretics by infuriated mobs who regarded the clergy as too lenient. But heresy was not. There we go. There's heresy right there. What is that? Dragon? Snake dragon. Is that an arrow in her abdomen? Right. So easily checked when it assumed proportions too vast and too perilous to permit of its being handled effectively by individual action. The church bestirred itself to arouse the clergy and the people in to the danger and created an official organ with express powers to cope with it, the Inquisition. The state was also a party to this conflict. The church held that the interests of the state were subordinate to its own in keeping the faith pure. Offense to the divine majesty was a far greater crime than offense to a secular ruler, and the latter was in duty bound, since his position derived from the former, to destroy the source of the major offense. Moreover, the church advanced the practical consideration that heretics were criminals against the state because they disturbed the public peace, and therefore the state was required to cooperate in rooting them out. The state showed no reluctance in obliging. The early church had occasionally visited heresy with death, but it remained for secular rulers of the 12th century and after to adopt officially the death penalty for heresy. Peter II of Aragon in 1197 was the first to do so. Frederick II made it optional in 1224 and obligatory in 1231, following Pope Innocent III in justifying it on the ground that heresy was equivalent to treason. Dismissing or releasing the heretic to the secular arm was the fiction adopted by the church to exculpate it from shedding of blood. This is not the place to examine the origins of this heretical wave, It is enough for our purposes to note the fact of its emergence. Cathar, Cathar, Catharists, is that Catharists? Catharists. I thought it was Cathartists. Catharists, Albigensians, Luciferans, Neo-Manicheans, Manicheans, Manicheans, Waldensians, Passagi, Passagi. The opposition to the church manifested itself under many heads and conquered extensive areas throughout Western and Central Europe. The weak episcopal Inquisition was inaugurated toward the end of the 12th century to stamp out dissent. When it failed in its purpose, the church embarked upon a more vigorous program, the Albigensian Crusade, a large-scale military operation launched at the beginning of the 13th century, incited incidentally by the Cistercian monk Arnold of Sorrow with the sanction of Innocent III, marked the beginning of the monastic Inquisition and of a virile offensive. The Jews of Provence were victims of this earliest onslaught, along with the Albigensian heretics. For all, it should be noted that Innocent refused to countenance the preaching of the cross against the Jews of that region, and it was evident from the outset that they would have to bear the full brunt of the continuing holy war. This raises our second question, which demands its answer first. By what sophistry could the Jews be included in the category of heretics? Heresy implies a deviation from a prescribed and accepted course, but not refusal to pursue the course ab initio. By all the rules of logic, the Jew was exempt from the brand, and the church indeed recognized and proclaimed that technical fact. All right, where did I lose it at? There it is. But popular thinking was free of logical restraints, nor did the practical policy of the church adhere too slavishly to its logic. In the Christian world, the Jew was inevitably looked upon as a heretic, indeed, the heretic. The rationale of this attitude was established quite early. Despite all the evidence to the contrary, some of the most influential leaders of the church in its earliest period were of the opinion that Judaism was not an independent faith, but merely a perverse deviation from the one true faith. We have already noted that the emergence of Christianity was antedated to the beginning of revealed history. The tendency to treat the Jews as heretics who knew the truth and rejected it is very pronounced in the apocryphal Gospels, which began to appear about the middle of the 2nd century. While the catalogs of heresies compiled by Christian writers included only divagations from Orthodox Judaism in the pre-Christian period, for contemporary times they included all Jews. In one of the versions of the Assumption of the Virgin, the high priest is made to exclaim, "Do we not believe in Christ? But what shall we do? The enemy of mankind hath blinded our hearts, and shame has covered our faces, that we should not confess the mighty works of God." An anonymous 4th century writer insisted that the Jews are to be treated as apostates from Christianity, as men who had known the truth and deliberately rejected it. The opinions of the 4th century concerning the relation of Judaism to Christian heresy were destined to govern the conduct of the church for more than a millennium. Parks observes it would have greatly simplified the issue had it been possible to equate the two terms, and there are many signs among the theologians and religious writers of the 4th and subsequent centuries, indicating their ambition to do so. If this ambition found no legal expression, it was nonetheless realized in prevailing opinion. So pronounced and vicious was the Jewish error that public opinion often held it responsible for the rise of other heresies within the church. The Nestorians were frequently referred to as Jews, and the iconoclastic revolt was directly traced to the influence of Jews, and little difference in treatment was meted out to Jews and heretics per se. So it was that the later Middle Ages inherited the strong tradition placing Jews in the ranks of heretics and subjecting them to the same pitiless persecution. Maybe I am getting sick. Berthold of Regensburg proclaimed in his sermons that Jews are heretics, and their Talmud is full of such damned heresies that it is a crime to let them live. Nor was he the only one to apply the adjective heretical to the Talmud. A convert to Christianity invited to return to Judaism indignantly refused on the ground that his former faith was a Ketzeri heresy, a view he could have acquired only from his not new co-religionists, and in Spain the crime of subscribing to the Regia Judaica was imputed to a number of prominent ecclesiastics. This coupling of mutually exclusive terms is to be encountered all through the later Middle Ages. Arians, Photinians, Nestorians, Jews, and other heretics and fanatics were indiscriminately lumped together. Luther, who should have been an expert on the subject, rarely missed an opportunity of damning Jews with heretics in one breath. In fact, he referred to the baptism of Jews as a return to their natural religion. Moreover, Jews were generally suspected of inspiring the schismatic sects, and the commonest charge against these heresies was that of Judaizing. This popular version of the nature of heresy reached its peak during the Hussite Wars, 1419 to 36, when Jews were attacked from the pulpit throughout Central Europe as sympathizers and abettors of the militant heretics, and suffered widespread persecution on this score. In Vienna, where the theological faculty took official cognizance in its minutes of the alliance of Jews with Hussites and Waldensians, the rabbinic authorities even forbade all discussion of religious matters between Jews and non Jews in a vain effort to avoid the consequences of this charge. Everywhere the church and the people discerned the diabolical hand of the Jews, turning simple Christians aside from the true faith. Indeed, if Christendom admitted any distinction at all between the two, it was that the heretics were wrong on some points, whereas the Jews were wrong on all. Once again, we must emphasize the signal division between the official policy of the church and the realistic policy of its adherents. For all the church's insistence upon the identity of Jew with heretic in its popular propaganda, the logicians of the church still could not leap the hurdle of inconsistency involved. After all, the Jews were not and had never been Christians, and could therefore, on no logical premise, be accused of deviation from a doctrine that they had never espoused. In ecclesiastical documents, Judaism is categorized as a perfidy rather than as a heresy. Indeed, for all its inherent intolerance of difference, the Church officially recognized the right of the Jewish community to persist and to maintain its institutions in the very midst of Christian society. As barren, describes the rationalization of this anomalous lenity evolved by medieval canon jurists. Mankind as a whole is but the mystic body of Christ. In this Corpus Christi are included not only Christians, but also infidels. In it, each corporate group, each universitas, has a special function, as of a special organ within a human body. The Jewish community, also a member of this universal body, must be maintained as such, a universitas apart, with as much separation and segregation as possible. Barron justly concludes this formula is the more remarkable, the more uncontested the general theory and practice of intolerance became in the Christian world. Highly creditable the formula undoubtedly was, but unfortunately for the Jews, the jurists were very much in the minority. The general theory and practice of intolerance far outdistanced all official formulas. However strenuously the Church sought to preserve its position. The start of the crusade against heresy and the establishment of the Inquisition obliged the Church to delimit the area of operations in accordance with its juridical, one of these times I'll get that word right, with its juridical distinction between infidels and heretics. The former, who wholly denied Christianity, such as Jews, Muslims, and pagans, were excluded from the jurisdiction of the Inquisition. Only those who selected, which is the original meaning of the Greek, whatever the fuck that word is, their beliefs not accepting the full teachings of the Church were heretics in the special sense that subjected them to the vigilance of that body. Jews per se were therefore exempt from the solicitous attention of the inquisitorial organs. Only such Jews as had at one time entered the Christian fold and thereafter relapsed came directly within its jurisdiction. The Spanish Inquisition directed its activities not against the Jews of the peninsula and its possessions, but against the Jewish pseudo Christians, the so called Moranos or Conversos, who secretly persisted in their former faith or could be charged with doing so while outwardly professing Christianity. There are instances, though comparatively rare, of inquisitors compelling Jews by threats or by force to accept baptism and forthwith arraining them as heretics, apostates to Judaism. But it was not really necessary to resort to such crude methods. Every expulsion and persecution produced a large number of converts, many of whom merely feigned conversion, and these, along with those whose conversion had been affected by strong inducements, often of a pecuniary nature, that did not materialize, frequently seized the first opportunity to return to their vomit, as the medieval euphemism had it, and became actual heretics. However, it was not unreasonable to apprehend that such reversions were often influenced by Jews, and the Inquisition felt called upon, therefore, to regard all Jews with suspicion and to try to intervene in Jewish affairs, ostensibly to prevent such activities. The technical limits of its authority having been defined, the Inquisition was speedily granted or assumed additional powers that enabled it to circumvent its basic restriction. In at least one instance of very far reaching assumption of authority, the Jews themselves opened wide the breach through which it clamored. This incident bears retelling, if only because it demonstrates the avidity with which the heresy hunters pounced upon any pretext to include the Jews among their legitimate prey. The writings of the famous philosopher and rationalist Moses Maimonides, Maimonides, I don't know how to say it, had aroused a heated controversy in Jewish circles early in the 13th century, which led to bitter recriminations between his followers and his opponents. In 1232, the Orthodox group in the city of Montpellier issued a ban on the Maimonist works and then rashly invited the Dominicans, who, together with the Franciscan friars, were prosecuting the Inquisition to proceed against the Jewish heretics in the same fashion as against Christian dissenters. The preaching orders exceeded with alacrity. One is tempted to surmise, even with enthusiasm, and after a search instituted at the command of the papal legate in Montpellier, all Maimonist books were confiscated. And in December 1233, the first public burning of Hebrew books was celebrated. This event provided sufficient precedent for the Inquisition to repeat. Let me start that over. This event provided sufficient precedent for the Inquisition to repeat it elsewhere and to include all classes of Hebrew literature. A month or so after the Montpellier auto da fe, an estimated 12,000 volumes of Talmudic and other works were publicly destroyed at Paris, and thus, having extended its new domain, the Inquisition assumed the right to confiscate and burn Jewish writings as it saw fit. In 1239, Pope Gregory IX, instigated by an apostate Jew, Nicholas Donin, now a Dominican friar, who labeled the Talmud as outrageously anti-Christian work, instructed the kings and prelates of France, England, Castile, Aragon, Navarre, Leon, and Portugal, and the heads of the two orders to seize all Jewish books and deliver them to the friars for investigation. The first public disputation of widespread consequence between Jews and Christians ensued, but the defense offered by the Jews did not avail them, and in June 1244, thousands of Hebrew books were burned at Paris and Rome. And at Rome. In 1248, after another vain effort of the Jews to protect their remaining literature, the Talmud was again condemned, and Jews were forbidden to own copies. Thereafter, during that, and the next century, the Inquisition launched one attack after another upon Jewish literature of all sorts and held Jews accountable for the possession of proscribed books. The secular authorities, influenced by the clergy, joined the attack. When Louis X permitted the Jews to return to France in 1315 after their expulsion by Philip the Fair in 1306, the charter he granted them specified that they were not to own copies of the Talmud. This was the first campaign in the violent war against the Talmud, which continued unabated into modern times, arousing an intense and uninformed hatred of that work as the source of Jewish blindness and obstinacy. A book filled with blasphemous attacks upon Christians and Christianity, with curses against Christendom, with foul immoralities and anti Christian stratagems, with superstition and magic. The 16th century saw another attack on the Talmud in particular, and Jewish books in general, with the converted Jew Johann Pfefferkorn, backed by the Dominicans, in its spearhead in Germany, and the Inquisition playing the same role in Italy. Thanks to the intervention of the humanist and some ecclesiastics, the Pfefferkorn agitation produced nothing more than a heated debate, though it aroused much apprehension among German Jews. But in Italy, the attack assumed more than literary proportions. In the 1550s, all available copies of the perversely heretical Talmud were seized and destroyed in a number of Italian cities, and Pope Julius III was asked by the Roman Inquisition to order similar action throughout Christendom. A Venetian commission proclaimed that every Hebrew work which rests upon the authority of the Talmud is entirely condemned by the Holy Church as heretical, profane, and prohibited. Thus, the Inquisition steadily extended its authority over the Jews, not scrupling to overstep civil and clerical jurisdictional bounds. In 1288, when 13 Jews were burned at the stake at Troyes as the result of a blood accusation, after a trial of sorts conducted by a Dominican invested with inquisitorial powers, Philip IV denied the right of the orders to supersede the secular authorities in matters appertaining to Jews. It is evident from the continual conflict between Inquisition and state over this very matter that the friars acted first and debated afterward, nor was the Curia in general more successful in enforcing the official policy of the Church. In 1448, Pope Nicholas V found it necessary to reprimand his inquisitors publicly and to forbid them to exercise jurisdiction over Jews except in cases of manifest heresy or anti Catholic activity. Their zeal could not be curbed even by papal intervention. On a number of occasions, Jews were directed to defray part of the expenses of the local inquisitor's office. Failure to comply with such demands rendered them punishable by his agents. The extensive powers which the Inquisition gradually accumulated made them liable for a wide variety of proscribed acts, such as inducing a Christian into heresy, sheltering heretics, circumcising Christians, building new synagogues, blaspheming the sacraments, handling the sacred host, etc. If he was not technically a heretic, the Inquisition still managed in devious ways and in many instances to proceed against the Jew as though he were. Of considerable moment, too, was the fact that the introduction of the Jew badge coincided with the start of the Inquisition and the war against heresy. Come on. This chronological correspondence was not accidental by any means. It became the policy of the Church to expose all its enemies to public notice and execration by means of distinctive signs. Jews, Saracens, sorcerers, priests, convicted of irregular practices, heretics. These signs were intended to differ from each group, but they varied from place to place and were often so nearly alike and so clumsily designed, consisting usually of pieces of colored felt sewn on the outer garments, that they could be distinguished from one another only with difficulty, and often not at all. Of all the prescribed groups, Jews and heretics were the most commonly encountered in Western Europe. It would have been the most natural thing in the world for the Christian populace to associate the two as members of the same fraternity. Here comes a sneezing fit. You done? I think so. A supposition that is amply borne out by the juxtaposition of heretic and Jew, both clearly badged in medieval illustrations. In view, therefore, of the unremitting propaganda attack upon the Jew, which to all intents and purposes ranked him with the heretic as an implacable enemy of the church and of the assumption of authority over him by the Inquisition, whose function it was to stamp out heresy. It must be expected that so far as the popular attitude was concerned, any technical distinction that the church recognized between Jews and heretics was incidental and of no practical import. If dissent was abominable, as the masses had sedulously been instructed, then the Jew was the abomination of abominations. The train says, hello. The roots and branch of all dissent. No theological distinctions could obscure his true role from the eyes of the common man. The supreme sin of Judaizing, let's say that together, Judaizing, I think it's Judaizing, attributed to every least whisper of dissent, ensured that the Jew was the adversary without peer of Christendom, and ipso facto he was to be classed with all who sought the destruction of the church and of Christian society. Whether they attacked from within or without, regardless of the finical dialectic of the theologian, of which the common man was wholly innocent, and which was, in any event, beyond his understanding. The notion of the Jews' unbound hatred for all things and persons Christian possesses a peculiar psychological interest. It is curious, though psychologically comprehensible, that just those periods and those men who have made a religion of Jew hatred, have most violently damned the Jew for their own dominating passion, hate. They are full of hate, is the constant refrain of anti Semitic literature, medieval as well as modern. Bernard of Clairvaux, who preached the Second Crusade, in which so many Jews met a bloody end, could yet inform his congregation in a sermon, "While we pray for the Jews, they persecute and curse us." The fable was often repeated from the pulpit, and the written page that it is a duty incumbent upon every Jew to instruct his children from the cradle to hate Christians, Christendom, and all its works. Jews were turned out of their ancestral homes and hounded from town to town on the express pious plea that they are mockers, scorners, and open enemies of Christendom. Could they but drown all Christians in one spoon, said Johann Eck, in the course of one of the most vicious of all anti Jewish diatribes, they would eagerly do it. From this background, the Heresy Association derived a peculiar and terrible pertinence, for it expressed not merely a suspicion of doctrinal and ritual divergence, which was bad enough, but a sense of imminent danger. Out of this background arose the picture of the Jew as an enemy of the people, never hesitating to betray his closest friend or the city or nation that sheltered him. A prime feature of this conception, dignified with the authority of such names as Justin Martyr, Jerome, Origen, Agobard, and incessantly reiterated during the Middle Ages, was the accusation that Jews curse Jesus and all Christians daily in their prayers. On the basis of a misunderstanding, possibly innocent at first, when the newborn faith could not fail to be hypersensitive to every breath of implied criticism, the will to hate concocted a miserable libel. One of the so called 18 benedictions composed toward the end of the first century referred disparagingly to the minim, which the early Christians took to mean themselves, though it was actually directed against sectarians within the synagogue. In order to avoid arousing Christian displeasure, once the church reached the position where it could make its displeasure felt, or perhaps under direct pressure, The offensive term was later changed to mulshanim, slanderers, but the change of a word had no effect upon Christian tradition, which persisted in ascribing slander and execration of Christ to the Jewish service, and in time turned up another passage as proof of the contention. This time it was an uncomplimentary reference in the Alamu prayer. Alamu? Alamu? Which bespeaks the unity of all men in the service of one God, to those who bow down to vanity and emptiness and pray to a God who saveth not. Christians who knew something of Jewish ritual insisted that this meant Christ and his followers, and clinched the argument by demonstrating that the Hebrew term for and emptiness has the same numerical value as that for Jesus. What were these guys? Numerologists then too. What's that called? Gematrian. The issue was not academic, for a curse was universally dreaded as an invitation to the spirits, which they might readily accept to do their worst. Jewish disclaimer of any such intent was, of course, unavailing, nor did alteration of the text put an end to the accusation and to the physical attacks it inspired. The passage was often blacked out of prayer books by the inquisitorial censors and was finally deleted altogether from the Ashkenazic North European ritual after Frederick I of Prussia in 1703 prohibited its recital and posted officers in the synagogues to see that his order was obeyed. Out of this legend of hate grew a library of tales about murderous attacks upon individual Christians and upon entire communities. Incredible as it may seem, the inhabitants of more than one city professed to believe themselves imperiled by some grandiose plan of the tiny Jewish community to creep up on them unawares and slaughter every last one of them. In Mainz, the blowing of the shofar ram's horn on New Year morning was for a time suspended because the Christians had once taken this to be the signal for a revolt and had ravaged the Jewish quarters. Thus, when we find that in the popular literature the Jew is regarded not merely as one with Christian schematics, or is that schismatics? Sorry, not schematics. Schismatics, but as the ally of the Moorish and later of the Turkish hosts that for a time threatened to engulf Europe, we must recognize this as virtually inevitable. In fact, so basic was this notion of the Jews' hostility that he was almost, as a matter of course, said to be implicated in every foray against Christian Europe from without, as well as in armed attacks originating with Christian forces, even attacks that never occurred. There was in all probability a substratum of truth in such charges, for the position of the Jews was rarely so secure that they should not have welcomed the change of whatever sort. But the practically automatic iteration of these accusations and the inherent impossibility of some of them indicate that we are often dealing here with the traditional story pattern rather than with fact. Tradition has it that when the Catholic Frankish ruler Clovis laid siege to the Arian Visigothic city of Arles in 508, the Jews of the city conspired to betray it to the invader, an act which, in all charity, one should imagine merited at least a miserly word of approbation from the Catholic chroniclers, who nonetheless roundly condemned it as an instance of Jewish perfidy. That Charlemagne succeeded in taking Narbonne only with the aid of Jewish treachery, the city fell to Pepin in 759, and that the Jews betrayed Bordeaux to the Normans in 848. Barcelona was allegedly handed over by them to the Moors in 852, though actually the city was not attacked in that year. They were also accused of betraying Toulouse to the Moors, and in punishment for this deed, a Jew was required annually to receive a blow in the face in a public ceremony. Yet the Moors never held this city. The consequences of the dissemination of such stories may well be imagined. The penalty exacted in Toulouse was puerile in contrast to the price usually paid. As a result of King Egica's Egica's, I don't know how to say that, report to the 17th Council of Toledo in 694 that the Jews were in communication with the Moors, inviting them to invade the country. All the Jews of the kingdom were reduced to the status of slaves, their property was confiscated, and their children were torn from them and placed in Christian families. Widespread attacks on Jewish communities resulted from the rumor that the Jews had conspired with the Moors of Spain to destroy the Church of the Holy Sepulchre in Jerusalem in 1010. Actually, the church was destroyed by Hakim in 1008. Europe experienced in the year 1010 a series of floods, pestilence, and famine, with an eclipse thrown in, which were interpreted as divine punishment for the destruction of the church, so that one may perhaps regard the intense resentment over the alleged Jewish complicity in the event as wholly natural and justified. The same fable persisted late into the Middle Ages. It was as convenient an excuse as any for despoliation and murder. During the baronial revolt in England, the Jewry of London was pillaged by the followers of Simon de Montfort, 1263, on the charge that it was plotting to betray the city to the royalists, having prepared duplicate keys to open the gates and Greek fire to set the house in flames. The incursion of the Mongols and Tartars under Genghis Khan in the 13th century, which reached to the borders of Germany, was said to have been secretly aided by the German Jews, who were alleged to have undertaken to supply the Mongols with poisoned provisions and instead filled the casks with weapons, and who suffered acutely from the rage of the populace. This type of tale was as commonplace This type of tale was a commonplace of medieval folklore. It is not unusual to encounter the Jew and the villainous Turk, the most powerful external foe and rival of Christendom in the later period, conniving together against their common enemy. When the Turks moved north against the empire in the 16th century, everywhere the cry arose spontaneously that the Jews were in league with them, serving as spies and in general as what we would call today fifth columnists. They were expelled from Bohemia 1541 and three times from different parts of Austria 1544, 1572, and 1602. Because of such alleged activities, if the Turks should ever come into this country, wrote a citizen of Prague, which God forbid it would be because of the Jews who showed them the way. The Jewish quarter of Candia, Crete, was ransacked in 1538 on the suspicion that Turkish spies were being harbored there. Yet, as it happened, the able bodied Jews were away that day preparing trenches and earthworks in anticipation of the Turkish invasion. Come on, sneeze. In 1684, when the Christian armies attempting to wrest Buddha from the hands of the Turks were beaten off, tradition demanded that the Jews be held responsible for the defeat, and accordingly mobs stormed the ghettos of a number of Italian cities and took vengeance on their inhabitants. The popular literature, of course, reflected this prejudice. To cite but two out of many instances, Jakob Ahrer's Comedy von Nicholas includes among its dramatis personae the figure of the Jew Moses, whose role it is to reveal the secrets of the Christians to the Turkish Sultan, and Barabbas, Marlowe's Jew of Malta, is aided and abetted in his villainies by his Turkish slave Ithamor. Luther often alluded to these tales of collusion as damning evidence against the Jews. So familiar was the association that in many instances it passed into an identification of the two. Thus, a Turk accused of piercing an image of Mary in an early miracle play was transformed into a Jew in a later version, while in several dramas, such as the Antichrist play of Ben Besancon and the Mystery de la Sainte Hostie, the Jew is represented as venerating Mohammed and swearing by his name. The same touch occurs in Robert Wilson's Three Ladies of London, 1584, by which time it was a conventional element in the portraiture of the Jew, recurring frequently in medieval drama and poetry. The coupling of the term heretic with Jew and Turk correctly reflects the prevailing view. Politics may make strange bedfellows, but sectarian polemic makes even stranger ones. With the advent of the Protestant Reformation, the reprobate partnership gained new adherents. The Church forthwith branded Luther and his fellow sectarians as heretics and Jews. When four professors of the Sorbonne were tried at Paris in 1534 on a heresy charge, one of the major allegations of the prosecution was that they had secured Greek and Hebrew books from Germany, where they had been printed by Jews who are Lutherans. In 1566, the Spanish ambassador to England reported the current rumors concerning the Turkish invasion of Hungary in these words: "Some Catholics think that the heretics are to blame for the enemy's attacks, and some even lay it to the Jews. But I can discover nothing particular." And Luther, who damned vigorously in all directions, saw nothing incongruous in execrating simultaneously as enemies of Christ heretics, Jews, Turks, and papists. Right and left, the sectarian disputants of this contentious century hurled the epithet Jew, reformers of one mind against their opponents of another. Catholic against Protestant and Protestant against Catholic. Yet even Luther, not the least adept, came to see that this would not do. There are gradations in mortal sin. At the last, in his Von den Juden und Ehrenlügen and vom Schem Hamferis und vom Geschlecht Christi, he repented his haste. It was not fitting that Jews should be included in one category with Turks and Papists. They belong in the unique company of only one, the devil, their master, their father, their God. The effect of this attitude was to place the Jew, beyond the pale of human society. The church enhanced Christian aversion for him by its policy on intermarriage, not content with prohibiting it because there can be no fellowship between a believer and an unbeliever. It condemned such a union with all the weight of threatened penalty at its command, not excluding excommunication and the death sentence as adultery. Nothing better illustrates the intensity of this aversion than the medieval attribution of the crime of bestial, bestialitis to the Christian who married or cohabited with a Jew. In 1222, a deacon, after standing trial before Archbishop Langton, was burned at Oxford on a charge of bestiality. He had embraced Judaism in order to marry a Jewess, E.P. Evans remarks on the irony that the Christian lawgivers should have adopted the Jewish code against sexual intercourse with beasts, and then enlarged it so as to include the Jews themselves. The question was gravely discussed by jurists whether cohabitance of a Christian with a Jewess or vice versa constitutes sodomy. Damhouder is of the opinion that it does, and Nicholas Bohr cites the case of a certain Johannes Alardus, or Jean Allard, who kept a Jewess in his house in Paris and had several children by her. He was convicted of sodomy on account of this relation and burned together with his paramour, since coition, coition with a Jewess is precisely the same as if a man should copulate with a dog. Jesus Christ. That's brutal, bub. The Attack Upon Usury, Chapter 13. How long is this one? Pretty long. 196, so that's what? Not that long. But we're done for now, so hopefully these next chapters will be pretty short so I can whip through this. Yeah, they're all pretty short coming up here. So what, we got 188. So we got 32 pages left. Not bad. I was hoping for more people being pissed that I was reading this book, but that seems to have ceased. Anyway, that's all, bros.